It had been 10 years. 10 long years since Charles Grayson had buried the past. Buried it with tears that never quite reached his eyes and a voice that trembled only when others were listening. The papers called it a tragic accident, a boating mishap off the rugged coast of Washington. His wife, Eleanor Hayes, had vanished in a stormy sea. No body, no life jacket, no witnesses, just wind, water, and one man who returned alone. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. He held a press conference, gave an emotional statement, hosted a tasteful memorial. By the end of that fall in 2012, the world had accepted it. Eleanor was gone. But Charles? Charles called it something else. A clean break. Now, in 2022, Charles Grayson was 60, powerful, and respected. One of the sharpest legal minds in the Pacific Northwest. A philanthropist, a public speaker, a man of unshakable charm. He lived in a sprawling estate on the cliffs overlooking Puget Sound. Modern glass, manicured gardens, the kind of place that whispered money and legacy with every corner. His second wife, Valerie, younger, polished, poised. His daughter, Madison, 24 and in medical school. The perfect picture, until the night she came back. The Morton Foundation Gala was an annual tradition. Tuxedos, jazz quartets, crystal chandeliers glittering like stars. Six-figure bids floated through the air like feathers. The air buzzed with champagne and status. And there was Charles on stage, basking in it. He worked the room like an artist, thanking veterans, smiling at donors, shaking hands with retired judges and political hopefuls. He looked untouchable, unbothered. Then he saw her. At first, just a shadow at the back of the ballroom. The lighting was dim, but her posture, God, it was familiar. Older than he remembered, silver streaks in her hair. But then, their eyes met, and the glass in Charles's hand nearly slipped. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she'd been waiting. She moved through the crowd slowly, steady, unblinking. Charles descended the stage like a man walking into a fog. His chest tightened. His throat dried. Was it her? Or someone who just looked like her? And then she spoke. So soft, so haunting, almost playful. "You buried me too early, Charles." He froze. That voice, that cadence, that smirk. It was her, or someone who knew exactly how to be her. But before he could say another word, she was gone. Vanished into the sea of gowns and tuxedos like a wisp of smoke. That night, Charles didn't go home. He drove. For hours. Aimlessly. In silence. The past, which had once been neatly buried beneath years of champagne toasts and press interviews, clawed its way up from the depths like a corpse that refused to stay still. It couldn't be her. It shouldn't be her. He remembered every moment from that night on the yacht. The storm, the fight, the cold in her voice, the fury in her eyes. The moment he pushed, no, the moment she fell. Or did both happen? Either way, she was gone. She had to be gone. Unless someone found her. Unless someone helped her. Unless she never died at all. At 2:14 a.m., he finally pulled into the circular driveway of his estate. The porch lights flickered automatically. The house was still. He opened the mailbox, more out of habit than curiosity. Junk flyers, real estate brochures, and one small padded envelope. No return address. He tore it open under the porch light. Inside, a wine cork from a 2007 bottle of Napa Valley Red and a folded note. "Still remember the night you proposed. I kept the cork. Thought you might want it back." Charles staggered backward. Only Eleanor would know that. That bottle. That night. A $200 Cabernet. He couldn't even afford back then. They drank it on a picnic blanket overlooking a lake just before he pulled out the ring. And now that cork had come back. With her handwriting. At dawn, Charles sat in his study, staring at the cork like it might explode. He didn't tell Valerie. What could he say? That the wife who vanished a decade ago might be alive and had just sent him a wine cork? No. Valerie asked questions he didn't want to answer. Instead, he canceled all his appointments, told his assistant he had the flu, turned off his phone, and poured himself a drink. But his hands, they were shaking too badly to hold the glass. That's when the phone rang. No caller ID. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then he picked up. The voice was calm, cold, Do you remember what I was wearing the night of the storm? His throat closed. You said blue made me look soft, she continued. But you hated soft, didn't you, Charles? He couldn't breathe. Who are you? He demanded. But the line had already gone dead. He barely slept. Charles Grayson sat in the dark, hunched in his leather armchair, the cork still resting on the desk like a landmine. The curtains were drawn tight. The air was thick with silence. But his mind was drowning in the past. And that night, that night, came roaring back in brutal clarity. September 22nd, 2012. The Red Ember. A sleek 42-foot yacht he had chartered for what he called a romantic reset. That's what he told Eleanor. That they needed time away, just the two of them. No distractions, no fights, just open water, wine, and love. But it wasn't love he brought aboard that night. It was rage. Eleanor had found something. She wasn't snooping. She wasn't paranoid. She was smart, too smart. And she had started asking questions Charles didn't want asked. Why were there discrepancies in the Foundation's financial records? Why was he transferring money to shell companies overseas? What was with the sudden offshore activity? And worst of all, she had proof. She told him she had made copies, that she had given them to someone she trusted. You either confess by Monday, she warned, or I will. Those words, they weren't a threat. They were a verdict. She had sentenced him. And Charles had always been the judge. The night was violent. Waves slapped the sides of the Red Ember like fists. The sky, once soft with dusk, had turned black and bruised. Eleanor stood on the back deck, arms crossed, her coat whipping in the wind. Charles brought her a glass of wine. Let's talk, he said, trying to sound calm. Just you and me. She didn't turn around. You always want to talk when you're cornered. He stepped closer. I'm still your husband. She laughed, bitter, sharp. You stopped being my husband when you started laundering money. The argument ignited. Voices clashed with the thunder. She turned to go inside. I'm done, she said. And that's when he grabbed her wrist. Just for a second. Just long enough. The deck was slick. Her footing failed. Her hand reached for the rail, slipped. She fell, half pulled, half pushed. And then she was gone, swallowed by the sea. Charles stood still. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a life buoy. He just stared into the black water, waiting for it to cover his mistake. And it did. The next morning, he made the call. His voice broke at all the right moments. His story was simple, heartbreaking, believable. She slipped. I tried. I couldn't reach her. Authorities reviewed the radar logs. The storm checked out. No surveillance. No witnesses. No motive. No body. They closed the case. Death by misadventure. But Charles, he knew better. And so did she. Now, 10 years later, the ghost he created was coming back to life. And he wasn't the only one haunted. Later that day, Charles's phone buzzed. It was Madison, his daughter, his only child. Dad. Her voice was shaky. Something weird happened today. She was calling from the hospital where she was doing her residency. A woman came in, asked for me by name, said her name was Grace Kingston. Charles's stomach turned to ice. She looked just like Mom, Dad. Madison's voice cracked. She knew everything. My favorite toy, the name of our first dog, even that dumb raccoon lullaby you used to sing. What did she want? He asked. Nothing, Madison whispered. She just said, tell your father I said hello. He'll know who I am. There was silence on the line. Dad, is she alive? Charles closed his eyes. His breath faltered. No, he said. No, she's not. That woman is lying to you. But even as the words left his lips, he didn't believe them. Because deep down he knew. It was her. That night, Charles sat alone in his living room. Lights off. Curtains shut. He flipped through photo albums he hadn't touched in a decade. Birthdays. Vacations. Eleanor's laugh caught mid-motion. Her hand on his chest. Her eyes bright with trust. And then a new message arrived. No name. No text. Just a photo. Of him and Eleanor. In 2011. In their bedroom. It was private. Intimate. A moment he didn't even remember being captured. And then another. A photo of Eleanor. Today, walking near the Seattle waterfront. Same green eyes. Same scar on her cheekbone. A little older. But very much alive. The final message read, I never drowned. You just stopped looking. Charles stood so fast he knocked over his glass. This wasn't a memory. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't guilt. She was here, in his city, in his daughter's life, in his shadow. There's a kind of fear that no courtroom ever teaches you to handle. It's not fear of prison, not even of death. It's the fear of being seen, truly seen, by your own child. And Charles Grayson was now staring that fear right in the face. It started with silence. Madison didn't call for 3 days. No texts, no check-ins. For a girl who used a phone home after every tough exam, that silence was louder than any scream. Charles told himself it was nothing. Residency was busy. Hospital shifts were long. He almost believed it until the doorbell rang. Not once, but 3 times. Slow, even, deliberate. He peeked through the peephole and froze. It wasn't Madison. It was an envelope, taped to the door. Inside, a flash drive. No label, no instructions. He plugged it into his laptop, hands trembling. And there she was again. Eleanor, walking, laughing, holding a grocery bag, shot from across the street. Zoomed in, shaky footage, but real. Too real. He clicked through more folders. Bank statements, offshore account logs, photos of wire transfers he thought were long erased. A grainy video file labeled Red Ember, September 22nd, 12. He opened it. His breath left him. There it was, barely visible. 2 shadowed figures arguing on the deck of a yacht. One of them lunging, the other falling back, over the railing, disappearing into darkness. It wasn't high resolution, but didn't need to be. He knew what it was. He knew who it was. That evening, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Valerie had gone to her sister's for the week. Charles was alone. And yet, he kept hearing something. A whisper, a creak in the hallway, the soft buzz of a phone that wasn't his. He tried to work, tried to read, tried to drink. Nothing helped. So he called Madison. She answered, but the warmth was gone from her voice. Hey, he said. You okay? A pause. You lied to me, she said. His throat tightened. Maddie, don't. Just don't. Her voice cracked. She came to see me again. Grace, or whatever her name is. She brought something. Charles clenched the armrest. What? A photo of me. In the sandbox. Holding all my stuffed duck. She paused. How would anyone know that, Dad? He didn't answer. She said you tried to kill her. Silence. Is it true? He stood up, pacing. Madison, listen to me. Is it true? He couldn't lie. Not convincingly. Not this time. I don't know what she told you, he said. But she's not well. She's angry. She wants to hurt me, us. But even as he said it, he could hear how hollow it sounded. Madison didn't scream. She didn't curse. She just said, she remembered everything about me, Dad. Every little thing. And you just sound afraid. That night, Charles didn't sleep. Instead, he opened every old album. He stared at photos of Eleanor and Madison, at birthdays, vacations, rainy day forts built from pillows. Memories that felt suddenly fragile, like glass under pressure. He flipped one over. A note in Eleanor's handwriting. To our little star, shine bright forever. Love, Mom. His hand shook. Another message came the next morning. No words, just an audio file. He hit play. It was his voice. From years ago. Drunk, muttering into his recorder, maybe rehearsing a legal statement, maybe just unraveling. She should have gone under faster. Damn water kept her floating. Should have tied something to her. Charles yanked the laptop shut. He stumbled to the bathroom, stared into the mirror. His face, drawn, pale, older than he remembered. The man staring back? He didn't recognize him. But the final blow didn't come from Eleanor. It came from Madison. She asked to meet. Charles said yes, hopeful. They sat on a park bench near the University District. Madison didn't touch the coffee he brought. She didn't smile. She reached in her coat and pulled out something old, creased, worn from years of folding and unfolding. A drawing. A stick-figure family. 3 people. A house. A dog. A son in the corner. She handed it to him. I drew this when I was 7, she said. After Mom disappeared. He nodded. That's sweet. I told my teacher I didn't have a mom, she interrupted. But I still drew her anyway. Her voice wavered, because some part of me never believed she was really gone. He looked down. Madison. She stood up. I don't need you to confess, she said. I just needed to see if you could. She walked away, and Charles was left sitting there with a stick-figure ghost and a truth he could no longer bury. The sea was merciless. It clawed at her skin, burned her eyes, filled her lungs with salt and panic. But Eleanor Hayes didn't die that night. No, she survived. Barely. When Charles let go, when her fingers slipped from the yacht's railing, when the dark swallowed her whole, Eleanor thought it was over. And for a few seconds, she wanted it to be. The cold was paralyzing. The water crushed her ribs, pulled her down like it knew her name. Every time she surfaced, the storm shoved her back under. Until a splintered crate, broken debris from the galley. A miracle. She grabbed it, clung to it, bruised, bleeding, half-conscious. And she floated. For hours. A distant light appeared in the mist. Faint, yellow, moving slowly. A fishing vessel. A trawler out of Port Angeles. The crew nearly missed her. But one man, scanning the waters, saw something strange, something barely human, bobbing like driftwood in the foam. They pulled her in. Her lips were blue, her eyes half open. No ID, no name, no story. Just a woman who had drowned and somehow didn't. She regained consciousness 3 days later in a regional hospital. Her first words? A lie. Grace, she whispered to the nurse. Grace what? Silence. Because if she said Eleanor Hayes, the questions would never stop. And Charles, he'd find her. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Her recovery was excruciating. Her body was wrecked. Saltwater burns, frostbitten fingers, hair matted with dried blood. And inside, something had broken. She jolted awake at night, gasping for air, clawing at her throat. She screamed at shadows, flinched at rain, cried at the sound of running water. But worst of all, she remembered the look on his face. Not panic, not horror, relief. 3 weeks after discharge, she was sent to a halfway home for trauma survivors. They gave her a small room, a second-hand sweater, and a new name, Grace Kingston. She took it, wore like armor. She worked night shifts cleaning offices. No IDS, no taxes, cash only. She never stayed in one city more than 6 months. She became a ghost. But ghosts remember. Every night, she wrote in a notebook. Names, dates, images, memories of Charles, of Madison, of the Red Ember, of the man she once loved and the predator he became. And then, one morning in 2015, everything changed. She walked past a newsstand, and there he was. Front page. Charles Grayson, smiling, standing beside a state senator, holding a gold-plated shovel at a courthouse groundbreaking. The caption? Widowed in a tragic boating accident, Attorney Charles Grayson continues to lead with grace and strength. She dropped the paper. Her hand shook, and in that moment, everything came back. The deck, the rain, his silence. He did this. And she had been buried alive. But not anymore. From that day forward, Eleanor stopped surviving. She started preparing. She saved every dollar, took computer classes at night, watched YouTube videos at the library, cybersecurity, digital footprints, data forensics. She learned how to scrub her presence from the internet, how to spoof identities, how to track bank accounts. She didn't want revenge. She wanted proof. By 2017, she was fluent in the world of shadows. By 2019, she returned to Seattle, not as Eleanor, as Grace Kingston, part-time tech assistant in a nonprofit down the street from Charles's law firm. She joined widow support groups online. She made small talk with his former secretary, chatted up the bartender at his country club. Bit by bit, piece by piece, she built the puzzle. She found out where he stored backups, which laptop he used late at night, what passwords he reused out of old habits. And then, finally, the jackpot. A hard drive from the Red Ember. Not in evidence, not in a vault, just sitting in a dusty box labeled obsolete equipment at an auction for liquidated marine assets. She bought the entire lot for $43. And when she opened that drive, there it was. Grainy footage, a date stamp, September 22nd, 2012. Not a clear shot, but enough. 2 shadows arguing, one falling, a hand reaching out and not grabbing. She cried for a full hour. Then she copied the file 17 times. 10 years. 10 years of silence. Of pain. Of being erased. Now she was back. But not to scream. Not to expose. To unravel. To make him doubt his memories. His lies. His reality. One cork. One photo. One phone call to Madison. It had begun. She once wrote in her journal, "Justice isn't always a gavel. Sometimes it's a whisper in the dark that reminds the monster, I'm still here." And now, after a decade in the shadows, Eleanor Hayes was ready to step into the light. For most people, 10 years is a lifetime. For Eleanor Hayes, it was a war. Not one fought with fists or headlines, but with silence, with shadows, with precision. Every breath she took after that night on the red ember was borrowed. Every step a defiance. Every whispered word a warning. You didn't finish the job, Charles. She disappeared into the undercurrent of society. Seattle, Spokane, Boise, back to Seattle. Rooms rented with cash. Jobs paid under the table. Names that changed every 3 months. But every night, she remembered. She wrote, not out of obsession, but strategy. The goal was never to destroy him overnight. That would be too clean. She wanted Charles Grayson to feel it, to rot in his own narrative, to question every polished photo on his wall, every compliment he received, every time someone called him honorable. She would make his life unlivable, one crack at a time. In 2017, she started planting seeds. She joined an online grief support group under her alias Grace Kingston. She shared vague stories, not about her, but about him. She became friends with one of Charles's former paralegals. Just small talk, just enough to get invited for coffee. She listened, smiled, learned. She found out where Charles kept his personal archives, what kind of whiskey he drank when nervous, what folder he opened most on his home laptop. She wasn't hunting for scandal. She was building a case. Then came the breakthrough. The hard drive, found at a bankrupt yacht company's estate sale. It shouldn't have still existed. It shouldn't have worked. But it did. She plugged it in and gasped. There, buried among old engine logs and maintenance videos, was the footage. September 22nd, 2012. A stormy deck. A confrontation. A fall. It was grainy. Barely legible. But it was there. The moment Charles reached for her and chose not to pull her back. That video was the thread, and she was ready to pull. But Eleanor didn't rush. She had waited 10 years, or a few more months. She crafted the first email. Subject line, "You still remember the sound I made when I hit the water?" No signature, no demand, just a reminder. She waited 3 days, then sent another. An old photo, their anniversary dinner, 2009. Charles's hand on hers, her eyes still trusting. A week later, a scan of a bank transfer he made in 2011 to an anonymous shell company in Belize. She sent it from a new burner email each time. He never replied, but she could feel him cracking. Then came the phone calls. Not threatening, not screaming, just one ring. Then silence. Once a week. Then every other night. Sometimes from payphones. Sometimes routed through spoofed numbers. He never said it out loud, but he knew it was her. He felt it. Valerie Grayson, the second wife, began to notice. Charles stopped sleeping. He muttered to himself. He paced the hallway in his robe at 3 a.m., staring through the blinds. He'd lock himself in his study and whisper things like, "She never screamed. She just sank." At first, Valerie thought it was stress, then paranoia, then madness, until she found the boxes. 3 of them, hidden in the attic. Inside, newspaper clippings about Eleanor's disappearance. A stack of letters, some desperate, some angry, none ever sent, all addressed to E. A flash drive taped under his desk with drunken recordings of Charles muttering to himself. Confessions, regrets, nightmares. Valerie sat in the dark, listening to his voice break apart. Should have tied something to her. The cold water just kept her floating. I didn't mean to wait. I just waited. Her hand shook. Her stomach turned. She had married a ghost. But now, she wondered, was he also a killer? She confronted him that night. Over dinner. He didn't deny it. He just sat there, eyes hollow. She stood. "If you want to fix this," she said quietly, "don't call me. Call the truth." She left the next morning. She never looked back. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply wrote in her notebook. One more thread unraveled. The suit is splitting at the seams. And then came the daughter, Madison. Eleanor had promised herself she would never drag her into this. But when she saw Madison at the hospital, so grown, so bright, so unaware, she broke. She couldn't stay away. She could not say something. So she went, gently, carefully. She brought the duck photo, the memories, the lullaby. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't explain everything. Just one sentence. Tell your father I said hello. 2 weeks later, they met again, in a quiet cafe. And Eleanor saw the child she had left behind in the eyes of a woman who had lived through her absence. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But they spoke. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt seen. Not as a ghost. Not as a threat. But as a mother. She wrote in her journal that night, "Justice is a long road. But I think I just found the sign that says, almost there." And Charles? He was unraveling. Madison no longer called. Valerie was gone. The firm had noticed his absences. The whispers were louder now, not just from the walls, but from the news. A new tip had been leaked anonymously. Allegations of tax fraud, bribery, offshore laundering. A formal investigation had begun. And Charles? He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. And soon he would break. At first, Charles Grayson thought he could control it. He told himself it was just stress, just coincidence, just bad luck. But the mind has a way of pulling up the floorboards when you've buried something too deep for too long. And for Charles, there were bodies beneath his feet, metaphorical and otherwise. The landline in his study began ringing at odd hours. Never more than once. Always in silence. The kind of silence that hums in your ears like a scream you're not allowed to make. Then came the emails, each from a different burner address, each like a scalpel sliding under his skin. Do you remember how cold the water was? You said she was unstable, but you never looked more frightened than the night she vanished. Madison deserves to know the truth. No threats, no demands, just cracks, hairline fractures in a man who had lived his life pretending concrete never eroded. He started seeing her, not just in dreams, but in glass reflections, in the rearview mirror, in the hallway behind the firm's conference room, always out of focus, always still, always watching. Once, during a video deposition, he saw her in the background behind his own face on screen. He turned so fast he almost knocked over the monitor. Nothing was there, but the intern who watched him from across the room had already started whispering. He began pulling away. He told the partners at his firm he needed a personal retreat, told Valerie's friends she was ill, even though she'd already left him. He turned off the security system, ripped the smart speaker from the wall, smashed his phone with a hammer after receiving a single text. "I'm colder than I remember." His study became a bunker. Curtains drawn tight. Bourbon bottle half empty before noon. He muttered to himself constantly, like a man cross-examining his own conscience. She slipped. She slipped. She wasn't supposed to float. It should have ended then, but it didn't. One night, he swore he saw her on the lawn, Schokkingvet, wearing the same navy dress she had worn the night she died. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring. He didn't call the cops. He didn't even open the door. He just sat and stared back until she vanished into mist. He tried therapy once, at Valerie's urging, before she left. The therapist asked him, "What do you fear most?" Charles laughed. "That she'll come back." The therapist smiled politely. Boo! He never answered. And then, the final crack. Madison. She called him. Cold. Quiet. Unrecognizable. "I saw her again, Dad." Charles didn't speak. "She told me everything. Show me the photos. The letters. Even the footage. Maddie, please." "Don't," she cut in. "You lied to me. About everything." A long pause. "You said she died in a storm. You said she fell. You held a memorial. But I talked to her, Dad, and she knew everything. Things no stranger could ever fake." Charles clenched the phone until his knuckles turned white. "She's manipulating you." But his voice didn't sound like a father. It sounded like a man who had run out of lies. Madison exhaled. "She's not crazy, Dad." Another pause. "But I think you might be." Charles collapsed in the chair. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. And then a knock. 3 slow, Deliberate taps at the front door. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. He just listened. Then came a voice. Muffled. Calm. Familiar. You look tired, Charles. He stumbled backward like he'd seen a ghost. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry. She was still. You're not real, he whispered. Tell that to your daughter, she said. Tell that to your bank accounts. Tell it to your conscience. He snapped, grabbed the bourbon glass, and hurled it across the room. It shattered into silence. He tore open a drawer, pulled out the handgun. Hands trembling. You want justice? He growled. This is what justice looks like. He pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. And then the lights turned on. All of them. Overhead. Hallway. Study. Even behind the bookshelf. Tiny red dots blinked into life. Hidden cameras. Everywhere. A voice rang out from the hallway. Drop the weapon, Mr. Grayson. Detective Nora Whitmore stepped into view. Badge raised. Eyes hard. We got all. Eleanor stepped into the room behind her. Not shaking. Not weeping. Just standing. Alive. Whole. And unbreakable. Charles dropped the gun. Sank to his knees. Detective Whitmore approached. Charles Grayson, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Eleanor Hayes and obstruction of justice. She snapped the cuffs on. And as he was led out the door, broken, disarmed, defeated, Eleanor didn't smile. Didn't gloat. She just watched. Silent. Like someone who had just finished digging herself out of a grave. The courtroom was packed. Not just with lawyers, journalists, and rubbernecking spectators, but with tension. Thick, electric tension. It hummed in the walls. Sat heavy on every breath. 12 years after she'd been declared dead, Eleanor Hayes walked to the witness stand. Alive. Composed. Unshaken. Across the room sat Charles Grayson, in a rumpled suit, his once perfect hair streaked gray, his eyes vacant. He didn't look like the man from the magazines. He didn't look like the golden boy of Seattle law. He looked like a ghost. Eleanor raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth. And for the first time in over a decade, she did, publicly. In 2012, I confronted my husband about financial crimes I discovered within his firm. She began, her voice steady. He invited me on a weekend yacht trip. I believed we were going to talk. Instead, she paused. Not for drama, but because pain takes its time. He pushed me into the sea. Gasps erupted in the gallery. She continued. I survived. Barely. I spent months recovering. Years hiding. I watched him move on. Build a new life. Become a hero. Her eyes narrowed. While I lived under a fake name, in silence. The prosecution rested its case with damning evidence. The grainy yacht footage. The financial records. The emails. The phone recordings. The testimony of Detective Nora Whitmore. Everything pointed to intent. Everything pointed to premeditation. Everything pointed to him. When it came time for the defense, Charles stood. Not his lawyer. Charles. He wanted to speak. The judge allowed it. The room braced. He looked at the jury. Then at Eleanor. His face tried to remember how to perform. You want me to say I'm sorry? He began. You want me to admit I'm a monster? He shook his head. That's not what happened. Murmurs echoed across the room. That trip was supposed to save our marriage. She was paranoid. Angry. She found things she didn't understand. He coughed. Just enough to seem fragile. She slipped. That's the truth. I panicked. I didn't shout for help because I froze. He looked directly at the jury. I've regretted that moment every day since. But it wasn't murder. His voice cracked. He almost looked believable. Almost. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, she said. With permission, Ms. Hayes would like to offer a rebuttal. Granted. Eleanor didn't return to the podium. She stepped toward Charles. Just a few feet away. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't tremble. She met his eyes. And held them. He says I slipped. But he waited. He says I was unstable. But I was the one holding our marriage together. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone. He watched the waves take me. And saw a future without consequences. She turned to the jury. I came back not for revenge. I came back because truth should not die in silence. The room sat still. Even Charles lowered his eyes. Not in guilt, but in defeat. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict rang through the room like a bell. Guilty. On all counts. The judge stood. Mr. Grayson, this court finds your actions deliberate, cruel, and remorseless. You're sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gavel fell, and the man who had tried to erase her was erased from the outside world. But justice? Justice wasn't a clean ending. Justice was a beginning. For Eleanor. As the room emptied, she didn't celebrate. She didn't weep. She didn't wave to the cameras. She just stood still, like someone who had finished fighting for the right to exist. Justice doesn't come with applause. It doesn't wrap your scars in ribbons or kiss the years away. Sometimes it just lets you breathe again. And that was enough for Eleanor Hayes. The trial had ended. The headlines faded. The cameras disappeared. And the world, as it always does, moved on. But Eleanor? She was just beginning. She stood in line at the Department of Vital Records. A man ahead of her argued about a birth certificate. A child behind her played with a sticky lollipop. And Eleanor held her past in a folder. Medical records. A court transcript. Her death certificate. And now, the proof of her resurrection. The clerk looked up, puzzled. You're here to be reinstated? Eleanor nodded. As someone who was never supposed to be gone. She signed the form. Linda Grace Hayes. Her hand didn't shake. She returned to the small apartment above the used bookstore. The one she had rented under her alias. The key still worked. The creaky floorboard still groaned near the window. She didn't change the furniture. She changed the photographs. The only one she kept was the one of her and Madison, at the zoo before everything. Before masks. Before graves. She trimmed the picture. Removed Charles. Framed the rest. This part was always real, she whispered. The rest was the lie. Madison began visiting on Sundays. At first, it was just coffee. Then laughter. Then silence that didn't feel heavy. Sometimes they talked about books. Other times about childhood. Rarely about him. And never about that night. Until one Sunday they did. They sat across from each other, the steam from their mugs curling between them. Madison spoke first. I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to protect me from the answer. Eleanor nodded slowly. Ask. Madison's voice was tight. That night, on the boat, did he mean to kill you? The silence hung like fog. Eleanor didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Yes. Madison swallowed. You're sure? Eleanor nodded. He didn't try to help. He didn't even shout. He just watched. Madison looked down. Her voice cracked. I had memories of him, you know. Good ones. And for so long. I blamed myself for forgetting you. Eleanor reached across the table. Touched her wrist gently. Don't. You were a child. You weren't supposed to carry this. But I did. Madison's eyes filled. And I don't know how to forgive him or how to stop needing to. Eleanor didn't rush the moment. She let the silence sit between them. Then finally said, surviving is messy. You think it's about escape or closure. But most days it's just waking up and trying again. One afternoon, Madison brought something folded in her purse. A crayon drawing. Stick figures. A house. A son. A child's version of a family. Second grade, she said. They asked us to draw our family. I told the teacher I didn't have a mom, but when I got home, I drew you anyway. Eleanor held the paper like it might dissolve. Tears slipped quietly down her face. Not of pain, but of recognition. Even in absence, she had still been seen. They didn't fix everything that day, but a wall cracked. A door opened. And one Sunday, Madison didn't say Linda. She said, Mom. And Eleanor, she cried. For the first time in years, there was no revenge left to chase. Only stillness. And the slow, steady work of becoming whole again. Eleanor walked along the dock some mornings, where the red ember once floated. She no longer hated the water. She didn't fear it. She just acknowledged it. A chapter, not the ending. In her notebook, she wrote a letter. Not to Madison. Not to the court. To him. She never mailed it. She didn't need to. You didn't just try to kill me. You tried to erase me. But I found a way back. Not because I'm stronger than you, but because I refused to stay small for your comfort. You gave me a grave. I gave myself a second chance. She burned the page, and it felt like peace. One day, she stood at the DMV counter. The clerk asked her name. She smiled. No hesitation. Linda Grace Hayes. Because she had learned she could be both. The woman who once was. and the woman who survived. 3 weeks after the verdict, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, I watched your trial from a motel room in Des Moines. I cried through most of it, not because I knew you, but because you lived and I didn't. You tried to drown me too. I never told anyone. I thought I was crazy. But you stood in that courtroom and said what I never could. You gave me permission to believe, to speak, to stop hiding. You weren't just fighting for yourself. You were fighting for all of us. Claire, Eleanor folded it gently, placed it in a wooden box beside her bed, next to the crayon drawing, next to the photograph from the zoo, next to the cork from that bottle of wine. She wasn't building a shrine. She was rebuilding a self. That night, she looked into the mirror. She didn't search for scars, or lines, or lost time. She looked into her eyes, the same ones Charles once feared, and whispered, "I'm not who I was, but I'm still here. And sometimes that's enough."